Hello, everyone, and welcome to the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project webinar. We're happy to see so many of you with us online and perhaps also on the phone. I am going to do this very, very quickly. We have a wonderful webinar, lots of information with Zaretta Hammond, so I just want to give you a few little tidbits of information before we begin, but for the most part, you're going to be hearing from Zaretta, and I'll pass the screen on to her in just a moment. I want to remind everyone who's with us that chat is available, and so if you have questions, feel free during the webinar to put them in chat, but there will be some times available for questions, so Zaretta will definitely give you opportunities during the webinar to have any input or ask any questions that you'd like to hear more about. So as a reminder for folks that have not been on our webinars, my name is Connie Silva-Broussard, and I'm the director of the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. Zaretta, she's the other person there on the screen next to me. And then I have several other folks here from the team with me in the room, so just our usual. And just a reminder of some of the services that we provide as part of this project. We provide resources and information to districts in California dealing with disproportionality. So some of the folks that we work with directly are those that have been identified as significantly disproportionate, and we have a community of practice that we do regularly for those individuals. But we also do some information like this, information sharing that is for anyone, like this webinar. This is one of, we do quarterly webinars, and we actually have one more that will be coming up later this year. We have ongoing assistance, so you can see my name and email address there. I'm not the only one here. There's others. You go to our website, so you can ask for help as well. But in any case, we're available at any time to support you and provide whatever help we can in dealing with disproportionality. So we hope that you will join us for other webinars as well. And I'm going to pass as I said, the mic and the screen on to Zaretta Hammond, and she'll tell you a little bit more about herself. You can see just from this intro slide that she's an educator, a consultant, and an author. She has a new book out, and I hope she'll tell us a little bit more about that. And also, she's here locally in California in the Bay Area, and that's an important thing for folks to know because you can have easy access to her. So with that, I'm going to pass it on. Zaretta, welcome, and thank you so much for providing this very valuable webinar for all of our constituents here.
Thank you, Connie. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. And what I'd love to do is just kind of jump in and get started by telling you just a little bit about myself. So as Connie said, I'm here locally in the Bay Area. I was actually born in San Francisco and raised here, went to public schools here. And it actually sparked my passion for issues around equity. I was part of that first wave of schools being desegregated in the San Francisco area. And so that really, in some ways, shaped me. I've been 20 years in this field doing equity-focused support work with schools, coaching, professional development, inquiry in the classroom. I myself am a former teacher. I taught composition when I was in the classroom. And I enjoyed it a lot and get as much enjoyment out of working with teachers and being a support to them. So that's more of what I'm doing right now, and writing and staying connected to the classroom. My latest book is Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. Let's get that up there for a minute. And I am really excited to share some of the concepts from that book that I think are very related to talking about issues of disproportionality. So here are our outcomes for this webinar. Understand why addressing student cognitive development and RTI, response to intervention systems, is important to reducing proportionality. We'll get into more kind of what's the connection to cognition. Explore essential components of quality education or instruction in that general education classroom and see how they can actually reduce special education assignments. From the perspective of instructional leadership, review effective culturally responsive intervention practices at the Tier 1 and Tier 2 level, and to help specifically dependent learners become more independent in their learning. And last, certainly not least, identify core strategies leaders can use to shift teacher beliefs around student capacity. That's really important. So from the perspective of instructional leadership, I know many of you that are joining us today are leaders, so I just want to make sure that you are armed with thinking about your leadership in terms of helping teachers deepen their practice. I want to start with this definition of equity, and I'll come back to it in a variety of ways throughout the webinar. First, reducing the predictability of who succeeds and who fails. That's a hallmark of equity. And when we talk about disproportionality, it's a really important thing to keep in mind. We're trying to reduce the predictability of who's going to get assigned to special education and who isn't. And we know, unfortunately, that is more Black and brown children and poor children and English learners getting assigned to special education. Second, interrupting reproductive practices that negatively impact students of color. And thirdly, cultivating the unique gifts and talents of every student. So we'll keep coming back to that. I want to say just a bit about this idea of the predictability, the reproductive practices, and the unique gifts. Those are the kind of the key words we'll come back to. This is just a graphic to help us understand this idea of reproduction, because I think it's a really important part of the conversation. We see schools in the old factory model where certain kids are getting certain content, other kids are getting other experiences, different content, and predictably, you are producing students with different abilities and capacities and knowledge bases. And part of what we want to do when we talk about social reproduction, schools being kind of the factory of social reproduction, is really interrupt that. That school should be the place where students actually are maximizing their potential. I shared this graph with you as a way to start. It's from Doug Reeves. He's done a lot of work in terms of educational leadership, and he talks about the 4 different possibilities when we are making progress in a particular area. In this case, disproportionality. He talks about losing as being one of the experiences that we have routinely. We cannot seem to interrupt the predictability of who's getting assigned and the growing disproportionality. And he has some things to say about that low results, inability to interrupt it, low understanding, don't know what we could do different, is going to actually lead to replication of failure. And he then says there's an opportunity for you to get lucky, right? Right above that. High results, low understanding though, that something happened, things are turning around, but you have no idea how it happened. And therefore you can't replicate that success. And he says we don't want to just be lucky in terms of reducing disproportionality or improving instruction or improving special education outcomes. Instead, we want to be over in the lower right-hand quadrant at the very least where we're learning. We may be getting low results, but we're making some kind of progress and we're having greater understanding of what's going on. And there's a high likelihood that we'll have some success that we can repeat. Ultimately, we want to be in that upper right-hand corner, which is leading. High results, we know why we get these results and we can replicate them. And so I feel like part of this webinar is really helping us to move over to the right side. At the very least, being learning, at the very, most our vision is to be leading in this work. So it's just an offering as we start to kind of continue to think about where we are. I'm going to talk today about this work through the lens of RTI, response to intervention. And I'm sure the majority of you leaders know this system and are operating within it to some degree. And it has the 3 tiers. Tier 1 is your general education. Tier 2, struggling students need a little more differentiation, a little more intensity. And Tier 3, where there's a much more one-on-one support in terms of helping students who are struggling so that they will not fall further behind. And when RTI came on the scene a decade or 2 ago, we certainly had a lot of excitement about it. There was a promise that it would actually be the thing that interrupted disproportionality, right? A tool for addressing it. And here's why. These three things were things that we looked to RTI for, emphasizing accountability in that general education classroom. Students being assessed less on teachers' personal impression and more on database instructional assessments. So in theory, teachers couldn't just, refer students because they are with a culture class or they don't really understand the student's needs and were not able to meet that student relationship in a positive way, and consequently moving students towards special education. Instead, the data-based approach through RTI held out promise for interrupting that. But one of the things we are dealing with is the question of, is RTI the new gateway to disproportionality, right? There are, current reports and, reports coming out that RTI has more students from low socioeconomic communities going into special education. So really being aware that there's still some work to do in making sure that we can attend to what's happening in the general education curriculum at that Tier 1 and Tier 2 level. So here's the big challenge I think we all face, the vicious cycle. Right? So it starts at the very top. Students struggling as learning gaps, comes into a grade level with learning gaps from past inequities. Reading may not have been taught effectively. The teacher may have been new and not as effective. And consequently, the student goes to the next grade with some gaps in knowledge and skill. Then we move to the right where teacher misinterprets the cause of the student's struggle, especially something fundamental like reading or math, and then writes up a referral for the student around cognitive difficulties. Here's the thing that I really want to be able to talk about today. We usually talk about response to intervention or even disproportionality in terms of behavioral issues. But I want to lift up today that a lot of referrals are also for this idea of cognitive deficiency. The students are struggling because of cognitive learning disabilities that have, to this point been undiagnosed. But one of the things we know is this idea of students struggling triggers the next level of intervention at the very bottom, right? The decision making that is based on data, but that data in many ways triggers what neuroscientists call confirmation bias, right? The student is struggling, the data says the student's struggling, and the teacher says, yes, I knew the student was struggling, confirmation that we need to move the student toward special education, or at least to Tier 2 or Tier 3. And one of the things that we know in thinking about being much more culturally responsive is pausing there so that our beliefs as teachers, as leaders who are looking at the data are not being conformed and confirmed by past beliefs or what we think the data says about who those students are. Because what we know happens if that confirmation happens, the students are assigned to Tier 2 as the next box indicates, and goes all the way up to the next one, in which Tier 2 intervention strategy actually slows down instruction rather than intensifies it. So the student actually loses ground and falls further and further behind. So this is the challenge our students are in, and the challenges that we have as teachers and leaders to try and interrupt this predictability of the vicious cycle and what it produces. And I want to talk about culturally responsive teaching as a potential process that can shift the tide in terms of disproportionality. And it really revolves around what's the purpose of culturally responsive teaching. And I think culturally responsive teaching is really about helping dependent learners, learners who do not have the cognitive routine. They have the cognitive capacity, but not necessarily knowing how to strategize metacognitively in terms of independent learning. And I want to just say a bit about what do I mean by independent learning. Here are some characteristics of independent learners. Relies on the teacher to carry some of the cognitive load temporarily. Utilizes strategies and processes for tackling new tasks, regularly attempts new tasks without teacher scaffold, and has cognitive strategies for getting unstuck. So we know that student. That's the student who says, I watched a YouTube video and now I'm going to build a robot, right? It's very self-directed. In contrast, we find a disproportionate number of students of color who have not been getting the full benefit of their general education curriculum to be dependent learners. They rely on the teacher to carry most of the cognitive load most of the time, unsure how to tackle a new task, cannot complete that task without teacher scaffold, and will sit passively and wait until the teacher intervenes and doesn't really recall information well. And I think all of us can remember a student or two like this. And unfortunately, a larger number of our students of color who are struggling fall into this category. But the beauty of neuroscience and the idea of neuroplasticity is it tells us that this condition can be remedied. And that's part of what I think culturally responsive teaching brings us. So the solution, support dependent learners to become independent by building their intellective capacity. This is another fancy word for brain power. How do you get students to build that brain power so that they actually can take on more challenging work and to be more socially and emotionally connected to school in ways that reduce stress so that their brains can be in optimal position and condition for learning. And that's what culturally responsive teaching and learning actually brings to the table. So I want to say a thing or two about the definition. When I go and do workshops and professional development for teachers in school faculty around the country, I usually ask them, draw me a picture of your definition of culturally responsive teaching. And this is usually what I get. I get a picture of kind of the kumbaya effect, I call it, right? Holding hands, all different colors, the words together. If you can actually read some of those post-its, one says celebrating differences, inclusion, multiple perspectives, all sounds very good. But it actually is more towards multiculturalism that people usually are leaning than cultural responsiveness. And here's just a little way to understand the differences. Multiculturalism focuses on celebrating diversity. It centers on the social interaction across difference and concerns itself with, bringing in multiple perspectives, diverse literature that represents all the different cultures you might have in a classroom or in a school. And I find a lot of our discussion is actually around multiculturalism, whereas on the other hand, culturally responsive teaching is, and responsiveness generally, focuses on improving the learning capacity of diverse students, of each individual student, centers on that cognitive development and the cognitive aspects of teaching and learning. And this is why understanding the neuroscience and how the brain works really goes hand in hand with cultural responsiveness. It concerns itself with building resilience and academic mindset of students who up to this point may have internalized their struggles as a student. And as Carol DeWitt talks about, a fixed mindset. I'm not good enough, I'm not capable, therefore I won't try, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I felt like it was really important just to lift up the differences. So we're not talking about multicultural education. Very important, very valuable, but we are talking about culturally responsive teaching and learning. So being responsive in the process of building cognitive capacity, expanding their cognitive capacity. Here's a little food for thought. Classroom studies document the fact that disadvantaged students receive less instruction in higher order thinking and problem solving than do advantaged students. And I just listed all the studies going back as far as the 80s, and there are some that go back to the late 70s, all the way up to 2015, that highlight that this is a problem. Our lack of rigor around helping students use their mind well is really problematic, and it leads to deceleration rather than acceleration in terms of student capacity to do more challenging, more rigorous work. So when we talk about disproportionality and interrupting it, we have to be thinking about interrupting, particularly when we think about kind of cognitive deficiencies, right? The academic side versus the behavior side is really thinking about helping arm teachers build their capacity to know how to bring higher order thinking skills and problem solving skills to struggling students, dependent learners. So I want to offer 3 different factors that I think impact disproportionality. And that is the quality of the curricular and instructional support. What does that general education instructional delivery process look like? We'll talk about that. Intervention services for struggling students. When they need more support, what are we doing? And actually talking a bit about the cultural beliefs. What's the mindset that teachers are bringing in, and how as leaders can we really support teachers to make shifts in terms of seeing the capacity of certain students. Now, we can't talk about all of this, so I just kind of listed up 1 or 2 that I'll actually go into a little more depth. A low capacity instructional staff to cultivate the cognitive capacity in struggling students, right? What does it mean for teachers to actually know how to do this? The lack of cultural responsive instructional practices, interventions that are not consistent with neuroscience will be what we'll look at when we talk about interventions. And in terms of cultural beliefs, we'll talk about failure to recognize and correct historical inequities and interrupting microaggressions. So more to come on what all that means as we move forward. So I just want to pause. Anyone have any questions up to this point? I want to make sure that we're having the opportunity to interact. All right. So I will carry on. This is a graphic that really talks about the 2 sides of culture and how culture plays in this idea of culturally responsive teaching. Culture dictates emotional and cognitive readiness for learning. So trust and stress-free environment is critical for learning to happen, right? We want learning for understanding. That's what we want for our students. Information processing ease is the other key component. These go hand in hand. You cannot have students learning for understanding, learning at higher levels without that. And this is one of the really important things to remember when we're talking about disproportionality. Addressing the social emotional aspects, behavior practices, restorative justice, those sorts of things, really critical. But they are only one part of the equation. You also have to address cognitive and academic development. So the area that I want to start with is quality of curricular and instructional support. This idea of using culture, I think, has to be unpacked a bit. The question I get from a lot of teachers, and what I do when I usually go to work with the staff, is I give them postcards and index cards, and I ask them to write what their most challenging questions are around culturally responsive teaching. And they're burning questions. And usually I get this question: help, I have 26 different cultures in my classroom, what do I do? What I suggest is we have to start thinking about how to represent and honor all cultures. That's more multiculturalism, and it's important. But in terms of cultural responsiveness, I think there is an important element we need to be able to address for our students to make them feel more comfortable in the classroom in terms of social and emotional conditions, but also cognitively. And I say we start with the idea of individualism balancing with collectivism. And this continuum, we'll dig into it a little bit, On one end, 100 is the most individualistic you can be, and neither is good or bad. 0 is the most collectivist. So when we start thinking about a cultural orientation to bring in the classroom as a starting point, we should be thinking about these two ends of the continuum. And I want us to actually think about that in relationship to the kind of tension or conflict it actually can create in the classroom. So here's a graph from my book that I pulled together in terms of looking at the most individualistic country, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. But there you are, is the United States. We, as our national orientation is toward individualism. And I want you to take a moment. It's a little small on the screen, but that's fine. I think we can all make out the numbers and the country names. Find where the majority of your students are coming from, either as immigrants or where their cultural roots are. And I'd love for you to type that in the chat as you look at that. Okay, China. So that's a 20. Think about the numerical difference between 91 and 20, right? That's 70 points, over 70 point differential. Thank you, DJ. Okay, Mexico as well. Now, Mexico, very interesting, is a 30. So while it's a very collectivist country, it has some elements of individualism that leads with a collectivist, very family-oriented. Yes, Mexico. So we see a lot of our, who has any students coming from Guatemala, Ecuador, Panama? That's at the other end, yes. And the thing I'd love for you to be thinking about as you think about where your students are coming from is that differential. So if we think about students coming from Guatemala, which is the largest number of our English learners are coming from Central America, that is a 6 and an 8 in relationship to a 91. So actually starting to think about how we can be more collectivist is the first way that we can be more culturally responsive. I'd love to point out, too, that if we go up to around 20, you see right under China, Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone. That's where the cultural roots of a large number of our African American students come from. And I think it's an important point to make. That's a 20 on this scale. And while they may not identify with physically coming from Africa, what we acknowledge is the cultural roots, they are very African-oriented. So those students would have an African-American culture. Still, that's very collectivist, and it's a 20. So thinking about kind of what the tension is between a cultural orientation that's more of a 91 and one that is more of a 20 or a 30 or a 6 becomes important. So let's unpack that a little bit. So individualism has the motto of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right? This idea that we are rugged individualists. It's throughout our nation's kind of mythology and our slogans. It's focused on individual achievement and really is about the individual's contribution. We have status, who's getting the gold star today. There's a sense of competition that comes into that. And we are very analytical, right? It's a very technical approach. On the other hand, you have collectivism. And that motto is, I am because we are. There is a definite communal connection. Focuses on that interdependence and group success. And recognize that group dynamics and harmony are really important. Consequently, usually a collectivist orientation comes with the ability and a set of tools to actually resolve conflicts. That is highly prized, that talent, that ability, the capacity to resolve conflict so as to keep the harmony in the group. This is where restorative justice practices actually come from. When you look at a lot of indigenous cultures, Hawaiian culture, Hmong culture, African American culture, there are a lot of these similar types of practices. Very collaborative, and it's very relational. So I offer these to say, what's the starting point for being much more culturally responsive? Being more collectivist, more communal. And that in itself will start to impact some of the behavioral issues. So I think it's a really important connection to make. So here's one takeaway as we move out of Area 1. Engage and support teachers to arrange more of that general education, Tier 1 instruction around collectivist structures. So as you're doing walkthroughs, be thinking about how is this classroom set up so students are authentically interacting with each other. Discussion structures, what are they using? Protocols to teach students how to engage in instructional conversation and accountable talk. Social games that actually can replace do-nows, that still are moving the content and coverage forward, but are leveraging students' orientation around culture and collectivism. So I want to pause there. We've got quite a few folks that are joining us, and if there are any questions before I talk about the next area, I'd love to hear what's on your mind, reactions, connections, as well as questions. All right, so you can type in as I'm talking. I will just assume that the wheels are turning or you're feverishly taking notes, but continue to think about it. Pop any questions in the chat and we'll take them as they come up. So I want to transition a bit, but of course anything is up for discussion if a question pops in your mind. The next piece I want us to think about in relationship to creating a more collectivist set of structures in your classrooms, in your school, is this idea of the information processing cycle. How well are students using their minds, particularly our struggling students? How are we apprenticing them into being able to do rigorous problem solving, creative problem solving, and higher order thinking? And neuroscience tells us it starts with the information processing cycle. So the first part of that cycle is attention, getting the student's attention. But I think the most important part is actually thinking about this middle area, middle phase we call elaboration. Elaboration is when we are mixing our knowledge up. And so I use this picture of Cold Stone Ice Creamery, and I know the majority of us have been there, whether we want to admit it or not. But it is a really great metaphor for thinking about what the brain is doing during information processing. And it really goes to the idea that we are, I'm going to go back to the slide, that we are mixing, having students mix up old knowledge with their new knowledge. That what is really critical is that they find the opportunity to surface what they know. We used to call this activate prior knowledge, but it really is more than that. So what are the cultural funds of knowledge that they have, and how are those being brought to the content? And so that students are able to use those cultural reference points as a scaffold during instruction, so that they can process and better understand the new content in relationship to it. This is how culture becomes a cognitive scaffold. And I think it's important here just to kind of zoom out as we're doing to actually think about this information processing cycle, because it's a place that I think a lot of teachers don't have as much language around and depth of knowledge around. But it becomes really important if we're thinking about interrupting that predictability of students struggling without teachers knowing how to intervene. They will continue to struggle. So elaboration is a really important part of helping them interrupt that cycle of struggle, that vicious cycle. The next piece is consolidation. And consolidation is an interesting part of the cycle because it comes a time after elaboration, when the brain is settling down, when it's trying to actually pull all the information together and consolidating. What does this mean? Where am I going to store this information? So it moves it from kind of the working memory to the long-term memory and making connections in terms of understanding. Consolidation is kind of where the understanding actually happens in the brain, and I think it's a pretty important piece to remember. This is the piece that I think kind of supports why consolidation in a general classroom and in Tier 2 instruction is really critical. Before learning, we can see a little dendrite, not much going on there, but during learning, like right now, we probably are sprouting dendrites, I have no doubt, that you can see the branches of the neurons starting to grow. A full 24 to 48 hours, that dendrite, because it's consolidating information, still kind of thinking about it and making connections, is a full bush, right? It is branches of dendrites and neurons making other connections to other neurons, and this is the start of a neural pathway. The more neural pathways students have, the higher they can process information. So this is a really critical part of interrupting the achievement gap and helping students use their minds well and grow their brain power. Now, here's a little tidbit I'll share with you that, from neuroscience that really is important to us as educators. If the student does not revisit this information, the new content that he just learned, in 12 to 24 hours, the brain assumes he doesn't want to use it and will start pruning. And pruning means that those lovely branches of new neural connections will actually be reabsorbed. And what will happen is we'll go back to having the skinny little dendrite that we had before learning. So it becomes really important for teachers and for leaders to understand what this information cycle can do for our struggling students when we are actually creating instruction that moves that forward through elaboration and consolidation. In addition, in the classroom, we should have, in addition to behavior norms, we should have what Ron Rickert, author of Making Learning Visible, talked about as social cognitive norms. I love this idea, but it's also one that's been around for a while. Carol Dweck, in many ways, kind of called for these new ways of thinking about learning. But I think they should be much more explicit. When we are doing walkthroughs in the classroom, do we see these kinds of norms displayed? Number one, errors are information. The idea that mistakes are valuable, right? Errors promote discussion and learning. This is a norm that students, particularly struggling students who may have a fixed mindset, have to absorb. That academic mindset that will make them persevere when learning gets hard is rooted in this idea of understanding errors are just information. I call it the first pancake approach, helping students understand that they're going to make mistakes, just like when we cook the first pancake, right? Nobody eats the first pancake, but we get really excited because once the first pancake is cooked and it comes out as brown or burnt on one side and gooey on the other, we are excited because the heat of the pan has been adjusted, the thickness of the batter is going to just, all the adjustments, all this was information so that, ooh, the good pancakes are going to come up next. So helping students kind of reframe errors is the first step in terms of kind of shifting the cognitive norms in the classroom. Asking questions until it begins to make sense. This is not just kind of throwing students in the deep end of the pool, but it's really having them go through an internal cognitive routine, giving them some questions that lead to other connections, using non-linguistic representations to make meaning. Robert Marzano talks about this a lot, helping students use drawing, art, other things to learn for understanding, and thinking dispositions to begin connecting the dots, right? Are we making connections? How am I to think about this? Am I thinking about it in terms of cause and effect? Am I thinking about it in terms of how things are connected? So the big idea here is if we really want to help students use their minds well, to be better at problem solving, and the kind of cognitive rigor that is going to help students, particularly our struggling students of color, not be moved toward Tier 2 or Tier 3 in response to intervention systems, then we really want to set up cognitive processes and development in the general education program. We want to also be able to help them use their minds well in collectivist ways, building on the distributed expertise of the group. So that becomes really important. All right, so takeaway 2, when we think about this area of helping students use their minds well, assess the quality of the information processing that's happening in classrooms, especially for struggling students. One of the things we know is that if you slow things down, the brain does not grow. The brain actually needs active, stimulating learning in order to grow. So look for that active learning. And is the learning meaningful? Or students actually have to do some level of what they call productive struggle. That becomes really, really important. The other thing I think is really critical, and it doesn't feel like it's connected to culturally responsive teaching, but I think it is. Support teachers to learn more about neuroscience of learning. And here's the connection I make to that. In many indigenous cultures, you have the beginnings of neuroscience. They understood how the brain worked and leveraged that understanding. And so helping teachers really go back to using the brain's natural ways of learning through music, through interaction, all the things we know, and brain-based learning has become a fad. But I would say more in terms of what neuroscience is telling us about learning, the process of information, the way that students make meaning becomes a really important conversation, particularly in relationship to culturally responsive teaching. And provide that professional development that helps teachers use more collectivist strategies, I think is really critical. All right, I want to pause. Anybody have any questions? You're a quiet group today. All right. So I just talked about area 1, right? Looking at the curricular and the instructional. Thank you, Claudia. I appreciate that. We just looked at kind of the larger context for culturally responsive teaching. We just looked at the instructional strategy around improving information processing. Now what I want to do in this area, number 2, is actually unpack that. Well, what is it that you would be doing that's more culturally responsive? What does that mean and what does it look like? I think we generally are using, overusing the word or the phrase culturally responsive. So it becomes kind of, I don't want to say meaningless, but it's kind of a catch-all phrase. And I want to be able to have us think about it in more specific ways. So here in Area 2, we want to think about the cultural learning tools that we can leverage to help students who are struggling build on the cultural tools that they're already using at home, that grandma might be using to help the child learn about taking care of the house or learning to cook or learning some aspect of daily life that they are being apprenticed into. And I think it's really important to actually lift up these cultural learning tools. Too often we talk about culturally responsive teaching as if it's kind of a mystery. We don't really know how it works and what the tools are. And my whole orientation is to bring more of the how-to to this conversation. And one of those how-tos is really thinking about the cultural learning tools. See, these tools build schema. They help that elaboration process we just talked about, mixing old content with new content. And then there's a set of elaboration tools that are different from the set of cultural learning tools for consolidation. So I'm going to speak to both of those a little bit as we kind of move through better understanding of what the cultural learning tools are. And here's my offering of 4 core tools, right, that we could break them down and to other specifics, but I really want to just kind of offer these 4 primary tools. And here's the reason why I think they are cultural learning tools. Well, it's not just that I think so, but research bears us out. When we look at the cultural practices within various communities, these are the tools that they're using. And they're cultural learning tools because they're the brain's primary methods for learning. Now, how do those two go together? They go together because one of the things that oral cultures, collectivist cultures that have an oral tradition primarily, do not rely on reading and writing as a way of passing cultural knowledge from one group to another, from one generation to another, it is really important that they were able to leverage these so that those bodies of knowledge remained intact. And so I want to say a little bit about each one. So memory, it's really funds of knowledge. What are the funds of knowledge that are accumulated over time? Puzzles and patterns, how does the brain understand how things fit together? So the brain's primary directive is seek out the patterns and things. And as it seeks out patterns, it's learning what to avoid, what to actually go towards, how things fit together, how to understand. Puzzles actually stimulates the brain to seek out the missing information. So it becomes another important way that the brain is driven during learning. Talk and task structures. So talk, again, in an oral culture, you are doing a lot of talking in terms of relaying information. But you talk in a way that builds on wordplay so that the brain actually can hold on to information. This is actually why we see, whether it's poetry or kids in hip-hop today, actually being very nimble with their wordplay. And there's a way that we can leverage that, not just because it's a cultural phenomenon among teens, but it's actually one of the brain's key ways of learning. And the last, but certainly not the least, is multiple perspectives. That multiple perspectives help the brain actually think about who's telling the story. What do I know about that person telling the story? Do I believe them? Is that a reliable narrator? So there are all these other things that go into reading stories across perspectives that are really important in terms of oral culture. So I bring them to you today as the set of cultural learning tools that should be utilized if we're talking about culturally responsive teaching. Each one of them has the potential to stimulate students toward more active learning because they require active learning. Now I want to talk a little bit about kind of active learning, why these cultural tools, what does the research say about it? So any of you have heard about, hopefully some of you have heard about John Hattie's visual learning, and he talks about this idea of effect size, that there are strategies that we could and should be using that are in the blue zone, the zone of desired effects. And the most effective strategies, when he did his meta-analyses, had a 1.0 effect. Anything that was a 0.4 was in that zone of desired results. At the other end, anything that was in the yellow zone or the green zone were less effective, all the way to the point where things in that red zone that had less than a 0 point were able to, they actually had a negative effect. So why am I sharing John Hattie's effect size grid with you? Because I want you to see how that effect size of each of the cultural learning tools actually lays over into the strategies that he lists. So we can look at memory, funds of knowledge, and their importance. When you utilize funds of knowledge, that is a 0.67 effect size. That is clearly in the blue desired effects zone. Similarly with talk and wordplay, that's a 0.82. And perspective, that is an 8.5. So what we know is these tools actually are strategies that are all around us, but when we leverage them in terms of culture, students' cultural learning tools, their neural pathways are overdeveloped to be utilizing these particular methods. And sure enough, the research bears out that when we use these strategies in our content delivery, in our general education curriculum, they're going to be more effective. Here's a key point. I think it's worth noting: processing that doesn't proceed to the elaboration stage fails to make connections that build understanding. So the importance, again, of the information processing cycle, not as something abstract, but as something that's at the core of the use of the cultural learning tools. When you understand that the cultural learning tools are used so that students get better at processing information, then you start to understand the potential of culturally responsive teaching in terms of its ability to boost the cognitive capacity of students so that they don't struggle, so that they don't get caught in kind of the tier 2 and tier 3 processes and find, that it becomes the predictability that a disproportionate number of students of color are in tier 2 and tier 3 and in special education. So I want to offer this. I usually, when I'm working with teachers, I usually offer them this as kind of a toolbox in terms of, well, those cultural tools are nice, but how do those translate into tools that I can use? And I share them with you as leaders so that when you're actually, again, doing that walkthrough, you're looking at what are teachers doing to get kids active and how are they leveraging kind of the cultural tools that come out of a collectivist oral culture so that students actually can be engaged. One of the things that you'll see, and I'll just make a note here, is that we haven't necessarily talked about racializing content. It's not necessarily about heroes and holidays. This aspect of culturally responsive teaching that actually can build the brain power is less about what am I saying about a particular racial group's contribution and more about using the cultural tools that students experience at home. So the toolkit includes a few things. Storify it. And what does that mean? That means our brains have this real desire for understanding stories. They call it story grammar. So we leverage that in terms of the talk and the wordplay in being able to help students make sense of complex information. So being able to put it in a narrative form that allows them to see how all the parts are connected becomes a powerful way for students to do two things: have fun and utilize kind of the wordplay, but also they're doing heavy cognitive lifting because they're having to take concepts, understand the concept, and then put it in a story form that actually makes sense in terms of how that story unfolds. Gamification, growing research that says that students actually play games which are predicated on puzzles and patterns that the brain is trying to figure out, that increases both focus, attention, reduces behavior issues, and allows the brain to do this kind of higher order thinking. Word concept sorting, another form of puzzle and patterns. You can use that in terms of reading. Elementary teachers use it a lot, but we should see more of it in middle school and high school. Instructional conversation. How are students actually talking to each other about meaningful things? So memory, as well as talking wordplay, and reciprocal teaching. That's been around forever, and being able to think about leveraging that, because when we have to teach something to someone else, it leverages or it deepens our own understanding. And this sometimes is what students who are living in the more communal communities are doing, teaching the younger ones or being taught by their older siblings or cousins or aunts, to leveraging the fact that they are able to do that is important. Yes, you certainly can get some handouts. I saw the question there. Thank you, Jen, for attending to that. And I also can make sure that for the replay we upload the Individualism and Collectivism continuum if you'd like to have that. And then you have the other things that are here in the slide deck. All right, so I'm going to offer a takeaway as kind of I wrap this piece up in terms of kind of the cultural learning tools that we should see active in most classrooms. You know, develop a walkthrough rubric for yourself that includes the use of these cultural tools and kind of collectivist structures and routines. You know, where do you see these things happening? How are teachers utilizing them? You know, how are students engaged? Include these approaches to learning in your evaluation process, right? What gets measured is what gets done, and helping teachers really see the importance of including them. Support inquiry and lesson study in these areas. So I think it's not enough to say we're going to have a 90-minute professional development session that's about culturally responsive teaching. There is no way that that as an introduction you could cover that in 90 minutes. But you certainly could offer an introduction and then have teachers in inquiry groups or doing a lesson study as they are moving to operationalize these cultural tools or integrate them into their practice over time. So supporting that kind of ongoing learning, I think, is really critical in terms of instructional leadership. All right, so I want to ask you a question. What are your biggest challenges in strengthening your Tier 1 general education program for your students that are struggling? As well, what are your questions around culturally responsive teaching as an instructional practice that might interrupt disproportionality? So I'd love to hear from some of you. We have got quite a few folks on the line. And before we go to the next section, I wanted to give you some opportunity to chat with us. Don't be shy. Yes, PD for your staff, creating awareness. I think creating awareness is really important. Someone typed in there, having professional development for your staff. Here's what I would say around professional development, around culturally responsive teaching. It has to be very coordinated. Because one of the things that we know is the issue of culture and equity and implicit bias can be very charged topics, and all of them are important to cover when you're doing this work. So you have to, number one, give yourself enough time. You may have a series around culturally responsive teaching. Help teachers understand that culturally responsive teaching is both a stance as well as a set of strategies. One of the things I hear a lot, teachers want, well, just give me the strategy, as if who they are and how they show up doesn't matter, as if the conditions for helping to teach thinking can be done with one strategy, one size fits all. So it's a much more nuanced approach. I think it's both a stance and a process, a set of routines, as well as the toolbox of strategies like those I just shared. So just definitely thinking about it much more holistically and much more as a series of professional development opportunities for teachers rather than one that is going to address all aspects. Yes, it looks different per teacher and per student. Here's the thing about culturally responsive teaching. Number one that we didn't get to talk about is, yes, there's a relationship every teacher should be building with students. I call it a learning partnership. So being able to actually think about who that individual student is, but also understanding the social political conditions of the community that he or she came from, their culture that they came from, how are all of these impacting who the student is and how the student is showing up, and then building a solid relationship with the student and building what I call an alliance. So that idea that you are trying to kind of create a pact with the student to tackle their most challenging learning targets or the learning gaps so that they don't feel like they're in it by themselves. I do think that is a one-on-one thing, looks different for every teacher and student. But there are some things that we can do that should look the same across a school and across the classroom. Not standardized, but you should all be using cultural learning tools. You should all be using collectivist structures. Now, which combination of collectivist structures can look very different. But in terms of using those core practices, they should be present. We should be able to see them. All right. Well, thank you for that reflection. All right. It's about 5 after 1, so I want to keep going and make sure that we can get through all the content. The last area I want to talk about is dominant cultural beliefs about diverse students and families, because one of the pieces that often doesn't get dealt with as thoroughly as we know it should is the idea of teacher beliefs or those who are making the decision about whether a student should go to special education, or whether the student has learning disabilities, whether the student isn't trying hard enough. All of these things we know are not neutral decisions. They are colored and shaped by who we are as individuals in the lives of students. I shared this picture. I, too, am Harvard, because I wanted to lift up the idea that there are dominant narratives about who students are that reinforce, right, that we talked about confirmation bias, that reinforce the idea that it's pretty predictable who the high-achieving students will be and who the lower achieving students will be. Harvard students, African American students at Harvard started a campaign because they were confronted routinely by this idea that people were holding these narratives in their mind about who goes to Harvard and who doesn't. And each of the students were lifting up some of the statements that were made towards them. This young lady, I thought, had a really good point she was making. You don't sound black, you sound smart. Now, what's really important to think about here is not so much what is on her, whiteboard there, but I want you to read between the lines. What's not on it? So if you sound black, that means you are not smart. So black is equated with not being smart. Well, we call these kind of microaggressions, right? These sorts of statements are reflective of internal belief systems that are not about individual prejudice or racism, but they really are a reflection of the larger dominant narrative that we are exposed to, right? So microaggressions, they are those small exchanges that aren't said in malice. The young lady that probably made that statement to the girl in the picture was not being mean to her. She was actually believed she was sharing a compliment with her. But they actually reveal the challenge we have in terms of this dominant narrative. So I want to say a little bit about that in terms of what do we need to understand about microaggressions and what they are and the role they play in terms of reducing disproportionality. So one of the areas of microaggression that Dr. Darrell Sue came up with, he actually has studied this for a long time, and he has categorized the different types of microaggressions that reflect some of our dominant narratives. And one of them is the ascription of intelligence, assigning intelligence or lack of to a person based on race or gender. So just as the girl I too am Harvard in the I too am Harvard campaign holding up her whiteboard said, you don't sound black, you sound smart. This is an example of that assigning intelligence to a person based on race or gender. And the common beliefs that come along with that are people of color are generally not as intelligent as white, all Asians are intelligent and good in math and science, speaking Spanish or non-standard English is a sign of low intelligence. Now what's really interesting about this is no one would actually say that. Most people say, oh, I don't really believe that. But the dominant narrative, right, the things that we say that are below our consciousness or casually referenced in terms of the media reinforce this. And two really interesting recent studies have been done by very reputable institutions of higher education that point this out. So at Johns Hopkins, March 30th, they just released a report that underscored that racial bias and teachers' expectations for students really were pretty predictable in terms of having lower expectations for black and brown children and higher expectations for white and Asian students. More white teachers were likely to doubt the education prospects of black boys and girls is the subtitle there. Another came out February of this year, and you can find these online if you like, just to reinforce the idea that we're not talking about something that's in the past. We're talking about a current state that we actually have to attend to if we're going to interrupt the disproportionality numbers. This one finds that just the faces of 5-year-old black boys in kindergarten triggers the amygdala, the threat consciousness of teachers. So this goes a long way in explaining the disproportionate number of suspensions in kindergarten that we see, or in first grade, certainly the earlier elementary experiences that a lot of children of color have. And one of the things that we recognize is helping teachers have conversations around these unconscious beliefs, being able to bring them to light is part of working on culturally responsive teaching. And it's one of the reasons why one PD session won't cover all the topics, because this has to be covered. But it's not the first one. Too many schools lead with, we're going to talk about issues of race. Well, that's not necessarily the starting place, but you do have to include this in the series of professional development offers you're going to provide in terms of helping teachers become much more culturally responsive. And here's a couple points I want to say in relationship to why helping teachers identify the dominant narrative statement that may be driving their unconscious action. That's because societal narratives are not benign, right? They shape an explanatory story. We become okay with disproportionality when we believe the story that, oh, their parents really don't care, or those kids aren't as motivated, or those kids just don't have the right stuff. And really helping people have the conversation that interrupts it. And we know this is rooted in kind of that factory model of inequity that schools created, right? Stripping folks of their language, justifications for slavery. All of those are where these narratives come from. So they are deep rooted in our country. And they make this dominant narrative up. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't counteract them, and that's the point I want to make here. That you have to have, as part of a strategy for being much more culturally responsive, so that you can start interrupting the disproportionality, is that you have to have a counter-narrative. And what is a counter-narrative? A counter-narrative identifies a dominant narrative, right? African-American students maybe not as smart as some of our other racial groups. And you have to now develop a different story that reframes, refutes, or restructures that narrative, and that it becomes the thing that drives you, your staff, at your school site. It's what you communicate out to parents. So parents know you really are about supporting their students to be all that they can be, even in a system that we know might have inequities in it. And helping them understand these counter-narratives as kind of your grounding points at your school site, what you say to each other, how it guides your collaborative work becomes really important. So I want to say a little bit about each one. The first, reframe. Help students see their strengths and capacity in new ways. So this means teachers coming together, you leader, helping teachers come together and actually thinking about how are you going to prevent students from internalizing the idea that the Asian kids are smarter than the black kids. Now, you may not say that, you may not hear them saying that, but that's actually what starts to get internalized. And in some cases, as we move into high school, students are actually saying those sorts of things. Reframing students' lack of success as a temporary state rather than a permanent condition. So as you're looking at data to make instructional decisions in the general curriculum, general education curriculum, students who struggle, we should see that as this is temporary. We're going to give them the supports to move out of that, even in the general curriculum, Tier 1, before we put them on the path towards special education. Calling out those dominant narratives that reinforce this viewpoint, and again, reframing or flipping them, or actually pointing out when they actually start to impact decision-making becomes critical. The next is refuting. And what is refuting? Just saying that's just wrong. Calling out the narrative stereotypes becomes really important. Developing, I think as leaders, what we call racial stamina. The ability to have these conversations with what I call distress-free authority. You can remain calm. People can talk about issues of race and class and inequity without feeling like it's an affront or that people should be guilty, moving people from the comfort of color blindness as a stance. We're all just human beings, but the reality we know is there is inequity in the larger social political context we live in this country. Helping people be comfortable with not hiding behind color blindness. This has been a process that's been given to a lot of our white educators as a way of counteracting overt racism. That if you are colorblind and don't see color, then you're not being racist when you are actually focusing on the race of particular students or a particular group in the negative. And so just being able to think about what does it mean to develop racial stamina as a leader so that you can kind of hold space for teachers as you refute some of the dominant narratives becomes really important. So the last takeaway I'll offer, focus less on having general conversations about race and more on identifying those dominant narratives that are influencing policy and practice and creating counter-narratives. Begin that explicit campaign to craft and disseminate those counter-narratives to both teachers, students, and I would include parents. Build that racial stamina, that ability to engage staff and other colleagues calmly in conversations about microaggressions and unconscious bias. And the last is create protocols and checklists to check assumptions behind so-called data-based decisions and instructional practices. I call this the check yourself before you wreck yourself protocol. Right? You don't want to have to be on the other end of having made wrong decisions or to see disproportionality actually moving in the wrong direction rather than it being reduced, it's actually increasing. Instead, having protocols that actually challenge the group to actually say, are we actually perpetuating the kind of dominant narratives that we usually see in terms of who these students are, in terms of cognitive ability? Have we given every opportunity at the general education level, Tier 1, for teachers to increase the rigor, kind of water up the curriculum for struggling students, and to bring in more of the cultural learning tools that students already have that we can leverage? So that fourth one becomes really important. So I'm going to pause there. We've got about 10 minutes or so before the end, and I just want to make a little space for comments, connections, questions that you might have. I've got great wait time. All right, I see somebody's typing. Anyone else? What's been your experience in terms of really helping engage students in terms of academic mindset, in terms of information processing, bringing cultural learning tools into the classroom? Is that kind of a new concept? I'd love to hear what's resonating with you. All right. So I'm going to ask Connie or Jen, do you think we should continue? I don't see any questions at this time.
Sure. It looks like everybody took everything in without any questions or concerns.
We are still processing, information processing. That's good. Hopefully dendrites are growing. Yes.
Yep.
Well, here, yes, the dendrites. We love that. So here's my parting thought as we start to wrap up. We do the same old thinking, we're going to get the same old results. And thinking about disproportionality in new ways, as well as thinking about culturally responsive teaching in new ways, I think is really important. You've just heard the tip of the iceberg. Culturally responsive teaching is a stance, it's a set of routines, it's also a set of strategies. And setting yourself on the path to be a leader who is well-grounded in culturally responsive practices, I think is really important. And taking it one step at a time is not something you can, go from not doing that today in your school to, oh yeah, by next October, we're going to have that. You can actually just get started and people have conversations and you can have a few pieces in place. But being able to just start with what are the old patterns, old ways of thinking that we can interrupt, I think becomes a really important piece. So I want to definitely let you know that there are opportunities to go deeper with me. I offer a 2-day Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain Institute as a way to actually get some language around culturally responsive teaching, particularly in the way that I framed it today. It's a 2-day intensive core concepts and strategies. And it's right here in Oakland, California. That's happening at the end of June. You can go to culturallyresponsiveteachingandthebrain.com, and if you're interested, sign up. You can also just follow up with me. In addition, I do, school support on site in terms of just thinking about that more intense level of operationalizing culturally responsive teaching, whether that's strategically thinking through what your plan is for culturally responsive teaching to address issues of disproportionality or making sure that all racial groups are achieving. That becomes really important. Or actually, doing some of the inquiry, lesson study, PD work. So I am here and available. There are 2 ways you can stay in touch with me. And even if it's just a question, a comment, a connection that you heard today on the webinar, please do. Hit me up on Twitter or email me. Because here's the thing that I believe, and it'll be the parting thought. We have to be a community of practice doing this work. No one school, no one leader can do this by him or herself. That the more we are in community doing this work, talking to each other, sharing thoughts, bouncing ideas, sharing concerns, problem solving together, the stronger we're going to be in terms of actually being able to get practices that we can use to interrupt the reproduction, to reduce the predictability of who's going to succeed and not succeed, and cultivate the unique gifts and talents of every student. We want to find ourselves in the quadrant of leading that Donald Reeves talks about. At the very least, we want to be learning. So I encourage you, continue to talk to each other, your colleagues, connect with me around these issues, just so that we can be in community and continue to do our best work on behalf of students. I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank the hosts. They do a great service to us by bringing these webinars, and I have just been overjoyed that I can be in conversation with you all today. I hope the rest of your day goes really well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaretta. On behalf of the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, it was a great webinar. I'm sure that dendrites are very busy growing. And we do have a short survey that we are going to put up now for you. If you will take just a few minutes to give feedback to the project and to Zaretta so that we can continue to develop great webinars like this one and also continue to become a community of practice. So thank you very much for your attention. We look forward to seeing you next time.